We naturally assume we are the authors of our own lives. We go to work, we make choices, and we fall in love, operating under the comforting belief that we are fully aware of why we do what we do. But at the turn of the 20th century, a young doctor named Sigmund Freud challenged that assumption. He argued that the conscious thoughts we experience every day represent only a tiny fraction of the activity happening inside our heads. To explain this, he compared the human mind to an iceberg. The visible tip above the waterline is our conscious awareness, but lurking beneath the surface is a vast hidden structure, the unconscious mind, filled with suppressed desires, fears, and memories. Freud dedicated his career to charting this unseen territory. He wanted to look past the surface of our awareness to identify the actual forces driving human behavior. His journey didn't start in psychology. Growing up in late 19th century Vienna, Freud was an intellectually gifted student who initially built a career strictly in neurology and physical medicine. At the time, the medical establishment at the University of Vienna operated on a rigid rule. If a patient was sick, there had to be an observable biological cause. Physical symptoms required physical explanations. But in his practice, Freud encountered patients who broke those rules. They suffered from severe conditions like chronic anxiety, sudden paralysis, and a poorly understood affliction called hysteria. Yet medical exams revealed absolutely zero physical problems with their bodies. This presented a massive contradiction. Freud realized that if the body wasn't physically sick, the illness had to originate from somewhere else. The symptoms were physical, but the root cause was trapped in the hidden, unresolved conflicts of the mind. Since these patients couldn't be cured through physical medicine, Freud began developing a practice of investigation, a method of verbal exploration that focused on bringing these repressed, unconscious traumas into the light. This search for the hidden origins of suffering eventually coalesced into a formal system he called psychoanalysis. Freud's structural model argued the unconscious is a chaotic battleground of three forces. The primitive id demands immediate gratification. The strict superego acts as a moral rulebook, generating guilt. Caught between them, the rational ego frantically mediates their aggressive demands and the limits of reality. Freud concluded that our daily anxieties, unexplainable moods, and psychological struggles are rarely random. They are simply the surface tremors of this endless, invisible war raging inside us. These internal rules and drives are not inherent from birth. Freud argued that our adult personalities are forged during childhood. He proposed a theory of psychosexual development, suggesting that growing children must successfully pass through a series of specific emotional and physical stages, which he labeled the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital stages. This produced his most highly controversial concept, the Oedipus complex. He theorized that during development, children experience deep, unconscious emotional attachments to the parent of the opposite sex, which then sparks a hidden rivalry with the parent of the same sex. If a child fails to properly resolve the conflicts inherent to any of these developmental stages, Freud claimed they develop a fixation. This lingering emotional roadblock hardwires their adult behavior and generates lifelong neurotic symptoms. Because this internal battle is completely unconscious, psychoanalysts couldn't simply ask a patient what was wrong. Instead, Freud looked for where it revealed itself, in dreams. He believed dreams act as a disguised fulfillment of hidden wishes. To interpret them, he separated the manifest content, the literal, often bizarre storyline you remember when you wake up, from the latent content, which is the hidden psychological meaning buried underneath. He also observed that the ego actively hides its struggle behind predictable strategies, unconscious maneuvers like repression, projection, or denial that he called defense mechanisms. By decoding strange symbolism in a patient's dreams and identifying which defense mechanisms they relied on, Freud believed a therapist could finally isolate the exact root of a person's suffering and help them heal. When Freud published these theories, he did not receive universal acclaim. His math of the mind faced fierce and immediate scientific backlash. Peers argued that his concepts were heavily biased toward upper-class European culture, overemphasized sexuality, and relied too heavily on his own subjective interpretations rather than objective, testable science. These disagreements were so profound that they eventually broke his own academic circle apart. His most prominent students began to defect, starting with Carl Jung, who rejected Freud's strict focus on childhood sexuality. Alfred Adler also split from the group to develop his own psychological models, focusing on individual power and social dynamics, rather than unconscious urges. Psychoanalysis had introduced a significant new way to view human suffering, but Freud's rigid insistence that every mind operated on his exact specific mechanisms was tearing his own foundation apart. Before he could reconcile these academic divides, history violently intervened. In 1938, the rise of Nazi Germany forced Freud to abandon his life's work in Vienna due to his Jewish heritage. He spent his brief final year in exile, dying in London in 1939. Today, much of Freud's specific theoretical framework is debated or dismissed by modern clinical psychology, yet his structural fingerprints remain. Talk therapy, our focus on the meaning of dreams, and our understanding of how childhood trauma dictates adult behavior all exist directly downstream of his practice. Freud moved the focus of psychology away from the observation of conscious thought and toward the exploration of the unseen depths of the human psyche. Even when his specific maps proved flawed, he achieved his primary goal, proving that unseen forces shape our every move.